Eleanor Marsh's children sold her entire life while she was still breathing. Not after she passed, not after a long goodbye. While she was lying in a hospital bed 3 miles away, hooked up to machines, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to stop any of it. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the house was nearly empty. A for sale sign was already standing in the front garden, and every single person involved was convinced they had done nothing wrong. But here's the part that none of them knew, the part that would unravel everything they had so carefully put into motion. Hidden behind the kitchen door of that quiet stone house on Clover Lane was a secret that Eleanor had spent 30 years keeping safe. A secret her late husband Gerald had built with his own hands before he ever knew he was going to die. And that secret was about to surface in a way that nobody in that family was remotely prepared for. Eleanor had lived in the house on Clover Lane for 43 years. She had moved in as a young wife with paint-stained hands and a second-hand sofa she was unreasonably proud of. The house was nothing special from the outside. 2 stories of pale stone with a covered front porch, a narrow driveway, and a front garden that Eleanor had slowly turned into something genuinely beautiful over decades of patient work. Roses along the left fence, lavender under the sitting room window, a small apple tree near the gate that Gerald had planted the year their youngest was born and that still produced fruit every autumn without fail. Inside the house, every room had a story attached to it. The kitchen table had hosted 30 years of school mornings, homework arguments, and quiet dinners for 2 after the children grew up and left. The sitting room carpet still had a faint stain near the fireplace from a Christmas Eve accident involving red wine and a lot of laughing. The narrow staircase had a 3rd step that creaked in a very particular way, and Eleanor had long ago stopped trying to fix it because it had become, in some strange way, a comfort, a small proof that the house was still alive. Gerald died 34 years ago. It was a long illness that came on slowly and then moved very fast near the end. He passed in the small back bedroom on a Tuesday morning in late February, while snow was falling lightly outside the window. Eleanor had been holding his hand. She did not let go for a very long time after. In the weeks and months that followed, nearly everyone she knew told her the same thing. Sell the house. It is too big for one person, too much to manage alone. Move somewhere easier, move somewhere closer to the children, move somewhere with neighbors who check in regularly, and a warden who holds a spare key. Eleanor listened politely to all of it, and then quietly ignored every word. The house was hers. Gerald was in that house in every way that mattered, and she was not going anywhere. What people underestimated, and kept underestimating for years afterward, was how capable Eleanor actually was. She had worked as an office administrator for a firm of civil engineers for most of her adult life. She understood paperwork. She understood how systems worked. She paid her bills on time, kept careful records, and managed her finances with a precision that would have surprised anyone who assumed she was just a sweet old woman tending her garden. She had also, very quietly over many years, been managing something else entirely. Something she had never once mentioned to her children, to her neighbors, or to anyone at all. But we will come back to that. Her 3 children had grown into busy adults with full lives and shrinking patience for long visits. Thomas was the eldest. He ran a property development company in a city 45 minutes away and spent most of his time in meetings, on calls, or staring at spreadsheets on a laptop. He was good at his job. He was organized, decisive, and confident in a way that sometimes tipped into something less flattering. He visited Eleanor on her birthday, and occasionally at Christmas. Sometimes he called on a Sunday evening. That was more or less the extent of it. Caroline was the middle child. She worked as a corporate consultant and traveled so often that she had stopped bothering to unpack properly between trips. She was sharp and professional, and genuinely fond of her mother in the way that people are fond of something they have stopped paying close attention to. She sent flowers on Mother's Day, and meant it sincerely. She just rarely had time for anything more than that. Ryan was the youngest and the most complicated. He had moved between jobs and cities and plans for most of his adult life, always certain that the next thing was going to be the thing that worked out. He was warm and funny and deeply unreliable. He owed Eleanor a small amount of money from several years back and had never quite managed to bring it up again. None of them were cruel people. That is important to understand. None of them had spent years plotting against their mother or wishing her harm. They were ordinary, distracted adults who had slowly let the distance between themselves and their childhood home grow wider without ever making a single dramatic decision to do so. It had happened gradually, the way most quiet damage does. Then, one gray Wednesday evening in early November, Eleanor finished washing the dinner dishes, reached out to pull the kitchen door closed, and felt a sudden sharp pressure roll through the left side of her head, like something had shifted without permission. The room tilted. Her hand found the doorframe. She tried to call out, but her voice was simply gone, as though someone had switched it off at the source. She registered the cold of the floor tiles against her cheek. She heard the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere above her, and then there was nothing at all. She did not know it yet, but her children were about to make a set of decisions that would define exactly who they were. And the house on Clover Lane was about to prove that some secrets are built to outlast the people who try to ignore them. Nobody called Thomas until nearly midnight. A neighbor named Pat, who lived 2 houses down and had known Eleanor for the better part of 20 years, had been the one to find her. Pat had noticed the kitchen light still on at 10:30, which was unusual because Eleanor was strict about not wasting electricity and always turned off every light before 9. Pat knocked, then knocked again, then tried the door and found it unlocked, which was even more unusual. She found Eleanor on the kitchen floor, breathing but unresponsive, and called for an ambulance immediately. By the time Thomas arrived at the hospital, Eleanor had already been moved to the intensive care unit. A doctor met him in a side corridor and explained the situation carefully. Significant stroke, left side of the brain, swelling that needed time to settle before anyone could say much with confidence. She was stable, but stable was not the same as well, and well was not the same as recovered. Caroline arrived 40 minutes later, still in the blazer she had worn to a client dinner. Ryan came after that, looking like he had driven very fast and not entirely legally. For a short while, standing together in that brightly lit corridor, they looked exactly like what they were. 3 frightened people who had just been reminded that their mother was a real person who could be taken from them without any warning at all. That feeling lasted until the doctor left. It was Thomas who spoke first. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not say anything obviously wrong. He simply looked at the closed ICU doors and said, quietly and practically, that they were going to need to think about costs. Medical care at this level was not cheap. Their mother had a modest pension and a savings account that would not stretch far. The house on Clover Lane was, realistically, the only significant thing she owned. Caroline did not argue. She said the house was going to be difficult to manage anyway if Eleanor could not return to full independence, which was a real possibility the doctors had already hinted at. Ryan was quieter than the other 2. He looked at his shoes for a moment and then said that they should probably just make sure they were prepared, just in case. None of them used any sharp words. None of them suggested anything that sounded, in that corridor at midnight, like anything other than sensible forward planning by people under genuine pressure. But something had shifted between the 3 of them that could not be shifted back. The conversation had moved, without anyone formally deciding to move it, from what is best for Mum to what happens to the house. Within 4 days, Thomas had a spare key and a plan. He told himself it was responsible. He told himself that clearing the house and preparing it for a potential sale was simply being practical in a situation where practicality was necessary. He called a firm that handled estate clearances and arranged for them to come at the end of the week. He contacted a local realtor to get a preliminary valuation. He sent Caroline a list of tasks, and she accepted them without pushing back. Ryan showed up on the first day with empty boxes and a takeaway coffee, and worked steadily and without much conversation, packing things into cardboard without examining them too carefully. Neighbors watched from front gardens and upstairs windows. An older man named Frank, who had lived across the lane from Eleanor for 12 years, stopped Thomas outside on the second morning and asked directly what was happening. Thomas explained calmly that his mother was seriously ill and that the family was getting things in order in case she was unable to return home. Frank nodded slowly, but did not look entirely satisfied with the answer. Later that same afternoon, he mentioned to Pat that something about the whole situation felt slightly too organized for genuine grief. Pat agreed, but neither of them said anything more about it. It was not their business, and Eleanor was not there to ask. Inside the house, the rooms emptied out faster than seemed possible. The sitting room furniture went first, then the bedroom wardrobes. Caroline handled the items with any obvious value, photographing them and listing them online with brief, accurate descriptions. A set of good china that had sat unused in a cabinet for 15 years. A writing desk with brass handles that had belonged to Gerald's mother. A small painting of a harbor that had hung in the hallway for as long as any of them could remember, and that sold within 6 hours for more than any of them expected. It was during the second week that Thomas walked through the empty kitchen and paused for a moment near the back wall. The room looked stark without the table and chairs. The counters were clean and bare. He noticed the kitchen door standing slightly open and pushed it gently shut. His eyes passed briefly over the wall beside it, where the wood paneling ran in clean vertical lines from the floor to the ceiling. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that drew his attention for more than a second. He turned and walked back toward the hallway, already thinking about the realtor's appointment the following morning. He did not press the wood. He did not notice the very faint, very thin line running along one edge of a particular panel. He did not know that behind that wall, in a small, dry, carefully built room that had existed for 30 years without a single person finding it, sat the kind of paperwork that makes property lawyers go very still and very quiet. 3 miles away, a nurse was checking Eleanor's monitor readings when she noticed something she went and told her colleague about immediately. Eleanor Marsh had opened her eyes. Eleanor Marsh had not cried once since waking up. Not when the doctor explained what a stroke meant for her recovery. Not when the physiotherapist came in and asked her to squeeze his hand, and she could only manage the faintest pressure on the left side. Not when she looked at her own reflection in the small bathroom mirror above the hospital sink and barely recognized the tired, pale woman looking back at her. She had taken all of it steadily, the way she had taken most difficult things in her life, quietly, and without performance. But when the nurse said your family has been taking care of things, something moved behind Eleanor's eyes that was not quite sadness and not quite anger. It was closer to recognition, the slow, heavy feeling of understanding something you had hoped you were wrong about. She did not let it show. She thanked the nurse and asked for a glass of water and spent the rest of that afternoon staring at the pale rectangle of sky visible through the window, thinking about a room that nobody else in the world knew existed. Thomas arrived the following afternoon, carrying a brown folder and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say. He sat in the chair beside her bed, set the folder on his knee, and spoke in a careful, measured tone that Eleanor recognized immediately. It was his professional voice, the one he used in meetings, the one that meant a decision had already been made, and this conversation was simply the formality of delivering it. He told her they had been organizing things while she was unwell, that the house was a great deal for one person to manage, especially now, that selling it made sense from every practical angle, that the money would cover her care and leave something left over, that really, when you thought about it clearly, it was the right move for everyone. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting once. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment, not with fury, not with tears, just with the steady, unhurried gaze of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it. "Did anyone go behind the kitchen door?" she asked. Thomas blinked. "Sorry? The kitchen door," Eleanor said. "The wall beside it. Did anyone look at it carefully?" He frowned slightly, the way people do when they suspect a conversation is going somewhere they cannot quite follow. "Mum, it is just a wall. We cleared the kitchen out. There was nothing in there except some old tins and a bag of rice." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I see," she said. She did not explain further. She did not raise her voice or make any kind of scene. She simply closed her eyes and told Thomas she was tired and needed to rest. He stood up, squeezed her hand briefly, and left the folder on the bedside table as though it were a gift. After he was gone, Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. She was not tired. She was thinking. The doctors wanted her to stay for at least another week. She told them on the third morning that she was leaving at the weekend. Her consultant sat with her for 20 minutes and listed every reason why that was medically inadvisable. Eleanor listened to each one with the same attentive patience she had given Thomas, and then told him politely but clearly that her mind was made up. There were things at home that required her attention, and they could not wait. She could not move as quickly as she used to. Her left side was slower than her right, and her balance was unreliable on uneven ground. She had a cane now, a plain wooden one from the hospital supplies room that she had not yet made peace with, but was learning to use without resentment. She was not the woman who had walked into that kitchen on the Wednesday evening 3 weeks ago, but she was still entirely herself in every way that counted. Thomas picked her up on Saturday morning. The drive back to Clover Lane was mostly quiet. Eleanor watched the familiar streets pass outside the window, the newsagent on the corner, the old library, the turning that led past the school where her children had spent their childhoods. Everything looked exactly as it always had, ordinary and continuous, and indifferent to what had happened to her. Then they turned onto Clover Lane, and she saw the sign. It was a standard estate agent's board, the kind with a bright logo at the top and a phone number at the bottom. It was planted firmly in the front garden, slightly to the left of the lavender she had grown from a cutting nearly 18 years ago. Eleanor looked at it without blinking. Her hand found the handle of her cane and held it. Thomas said nothing. He parked the car and came around to help her out, which she allowed because she was choosing her battles carefully today. Inside, the house felt like a place she had never been. The rooms were bare and echoey, walls showing pale squares where pictures had hung, floors showing dust outlines where furniture had stood for decades. Caroline and Ryan were already there, standing in the sitting room with the realtor, a young woman in a gray coat who stopped talking mid-sentence when she saw Eleanor walk through the front door. Nobody seemed to know quite what to say. Eleanor did not give them long to figure it out. She looked around the empty sitting room once, slowly, the way you look at something you are memorizing rather than seeing for the first time. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen without a word. Her children followed in silence. The realtor stayed where she was. The kitchen was cold and bare. Eleanor crossed it slowly, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the floor tiles. She stopped in front of the wall beside the kitchen door and stood there for just a moment, her fingers resting lightly at her side. Then she pressed her hand flat against a specific section of the wooden paneling, about halfway up and slightly to the right of center, and pushed with gentle, practiced certainty. The click was small and clean, like a key turning in a well-oiled lock, and the wall opened. Nobody moved. The hidden door had swung inward on silent hinges, opening a gap just wide enough for a person to step through sideways. Beyond it was darkness at first, and then, as Eleanor reached inside and found the small switch Gerald had fitted to the left wall 30 years ago, a single overhead light came on and illuminated everything. The room was not large, perhaps 2 meters wide and 3 meters deep, with a low ceiling and bare concrete walls that Gerald had sealed himself against damp, but it was organized with a precision that reflected decades of deliberate care. 2 metal filing cabinets stood against the left wall, their drawers labeled in Gerald's handwriting. A row of sealed document boxes sat on a low wooden shelf above them, and set directly into the far wall, bolted into the foundations of the house itself, was a heavy steel safe with a combination dial that Eleanor alone knew by heart. Thomas stepped forward first. He stood in the doorway of the hidden room and looked at it the way a person looks at something their brain is refusing to fully process. Caroline appeared at his shoulder. Ryan stood slightly behind both of them, very quiet. "Gerald built this the year before he was diagnosed," Eleanor said. She spoke calmly, standing beside the open panel with one hand resting on the doorframe. "He said he wanted to make sure that whatever happened, what we had built together would stay safe until the right time." Thomas turned to look at her. "Mom, what is in here?" Eleanor moved to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. She removed a thick folder, carried it to the kitchen table, which was gone, and then, without missing a beat, set it down on the kitchen counter instead. She opened it and spread the contents out methodically. Property deeds, land registry documents, solicitor correspondence going back to the late 1980s, investment records, trust certificates, page after page of careful, precise documentation that told a story nobody in that room had ever been told before. Gerald had started buying land while he was still running his civil engineering firm. Small plots on the outer edges of the county, the kind of land that sat on planning maps as agricultural or undeveloped, and that nobody with serious money was interested in at the time. He had bought them quietly, one at a time, over nearly a decade, spending amounts that were modest enough not to raise questions. He had understood, in the practical way of a man who spent his working life looking at land surveys and development projections, that the region was going to grow. Roads would be built. Housing demand would push outward. What was farmland in 1988 would be development land in 2005 and prime real estate in 2020. He had been right about all of it. By the time Eleanor finished explaining, Thomas had gone very still. He was holding one of the land registry documents and staring at an address in the lower right corner of the page. Caroline had her hand pressed flat against the counter, as though she needed it to stay upright. Ryan had sat down on the floor with his back against the kitchen cabinets, which under different circumstances might have looked funny. "These plots," Thomas said slowly, "the combined value of these is—" He stopped. "Considerable," Eleanor said simply. "How much?" Caroline asked. Eleanor told them. The silence that followed was the loudest silence the house on Clover Lane had produced in 34 years. What Eleanor did not tell them in that moment, what she allowed them to sit with for a little longer, was the second part. The part that her solicitor would explain fully when they all gathered in his office 4 days later. The part that made everything Thomas had set in motion over the past 2 weeks, not just morally questionable, but legally meaningless. Gerald had not simply bought land and kept records. He had structured everything through a formal trust, drawn up with careful legal advice and updated periodically over the years. The trust named Eleanor as the sole trustee and decision-maker for the duration of her lifetime. Nothing within it, not the land, not the investments, not the house on Clover Lane itself, could be sold, transferred, or altered without her direct written consent, witnessed and verified. Every contract Thomas had signed with the realtor was unenforceable. Every arrangement made with the estate clearance firm had no legal basis as far as the property itself was concerned. The for sale sign standing in the front garden was, in the most precise legal sense, meaningless. The solicitor explained all of this in a quiet office 4 days later, while Eleanor sat across the table and her 3 children sat beside her, looking at various points slightly above the solicitor's head. He was a patient man who had been managing Eleanor's trust documents for 11 years and had, over that time, developed a genuine respect for the way she approached difficult decisions. He then explained the second thing. While Eleanor had been in hospital, she had made a phone call. 2 phone calls, actually, on the 4th day after waking, before she had said a single word to her children about any of this. She had called the solicitor, and she had called the charitable foundation that managed several local causes she had quietly supported for years. She had updated the trust with clear and legally binding instructions. The majority of the land assets would pass to 3 named beneficiaries upon Eleanor's death: a stroke rehabilitation unit at the hospital that had cared for her, a charity supporting elderly people who wished to remain living independently in their own homes, and a fund providing practical support and small grants to young people from single-parent households who were trying to build something for themselves. Her children would each receive a portion. A fair portion, the solicitor said carefully, though he did not elaborate on what fair meant in that room at that moment. Thomas put his pen down on the table and did not pick it up again. Caroline looked at the document in front of her for a long time without speaking. Ryan, unexpectedly, nodded very slowly, as though something had just been confirmed that he had suspected for a while. It was Thomas who eventually broke the silence. He looked at Eleanor and said, in a voice that had lost all of its professional composure, "We didn't know, Mum. We genuinely didn't understand what we were doing." Eleanor looked at her eldest son for a long moment. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a woman who had loved her children for a very long time and had arrived, after considerable thought, at a very clear conclusion about what that love required of her now. "You knew enough," she said quietly. "You knew I was alive. You knew it was my home, and you knew you had not asked me." She gathered her copy of the documents, placed them neatly into the folder the solicitor had prepared for her, and stood up slowly with the help of her cane. She thanked the solicitor by name, buttoned her coat, and walked to the door. She paused there for just a moment with her hand on the frame, not unlike the way she had steadied herself against a different door frame in a hidden room 4 days earlier. She did not turn around. She simply walked out into the daylight and made her way, at her own pace, back toward the car and the house on Clover Lane, where the lavender was still growing beside the front path, and the apple tree Gerald had planted was already quietly preparing for another spring.